Yes, guys, welcome to the third installment of Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean. Obviously, in the first two episodes, we've spoken about the sort of first contact with the Europeans and the indigenous. We spoke about the Tainos in the second episode, and now in this episode, we're just going to go back to the expansion of European colonization of the Caribbean island chain, as it were, but then also just sort of try and go into what it meant to the actual indigenous, because obviously there was an introduction of new populations and they obviously had to integrate, and just go through just touch on the sort of 16th century, how it affected them. The frantic race for transfer of ownership of the Americas was about to gather pace. By the turn of the 16th century, coupled with frantic demand for new materials and goods to fuel the soon-to-be European industrial race, ultimately driven by the aristocracy's lust for achievement, the pouring down effect created instantaneous requirement for manpower in the agricultural fields. First, the European peasantry from places such as Ireland, Scotland and Portugal were cajoled into economic migration with the awarding of a rudderless ticket of no return. Inability to accumulate the workforce quota must have been quickly recognised. The tropical climate might not have been suited to European cannon fodder, as they were used to servicing the elite classes on a continent that extracted a much cooler weather stream. At some stage, it was decided that a need for a labour force must be recruited from further afield. Opportunity arose when, in trading naivety, the West Africans began to allow for the flow of Earth's original peoples to populate vacancies for the dungeons of slave mastery. The introduction of a new race equally isolated for thousands of years removed signified an end to the Taino as the most populous people of the Caribbean. Towards the end of the century, via recorded census, the true indigenous were by construct of formality made extinct. To be indigenous became symbolism of an undesired minority for reasons concerning survival. The indigenous would often conceal ethnicity on official documentation to avoid being left beneath the new society. On islands such as Puerto Rico, by the end of the 16th century, it had become increasingly frowned upon if one were of humble native origin. Therefore, it was advantageous for one by commandment of intercourse to assimilate with the significantly more politically powerful Europeans, or integrate with swelling numbers of African slave population as a means to camouflage offspring. After centuries of being erased from the pages of history and admittedly swindled out of recognition by the percussive numerical African chant for emancipation, the indigenous went unheard as their decibel level couldn't reach that of the Rastaman's drum, transported from the motherland. In retrospective transportation, the arrival of DNA exposes the real story. DNA findings have uncovered the true revealing. Hidden within the biological makeup of most modern-day Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Jamaicans, and especially Dominicans, irrespective of skin tone, strands, dating back to the time of conclusive purity of the Taino, can be found free from dormancy, alive and well in the living organisms of today that say they have roots seeded in the islands of the Caribbean. Poetically, Enriquillo's original tribal DNA flows through the veins of a substantial number of the Caribbean genome, which can be the reason behind why so many survived the rigours of slavery as the main mineral vitamin. An old adage in Jamaica clearly states, out of many comes one. This is precisely why the indigenous, by virtue of true royal blood, are of paramount importance when matters of reparations reach the council of agenda. New-aged access to information together with the world reaching renewed heights of historical consciousness, Caribbean indigenous traditions are in resurgence, as it is now recognized that apart from a few token reserved territories set aside, their blue bloodline has almost completely been fused with the African slave descendants of the Caribbean. Custodians of African Caribbean knowledge must guard this population at all costs, as they would be abandoning the soul of an ancestor that may have made the biological cocktail of difference that represents their sometimes slight, nuanced difference from their African counterparts. Woo! So there we have it. Into the 16th century now. The Europeans, they couldn't get the numbers for love nor money. Like they tried to get the numbers from within their own populations, but from whatever reason they couldn't get them to transfer to the Caribbean. They couldn't get the numbers that they wanted. At first they used their own people, but then obviously seeing what could be done, they know they needed a regular. They needed manpower. They needed another set of people. Also, as well, the climate may have had a significant effect. The tropical climate, the Africans may have been able to handle a lot better than the Europeans. So news would have got back, and it wouldn't have been a good living for them. So they couldn't get Europeans out there. So the next best thing, they went to the West Africans, and the West Africans, in trading naivety, decided to sell via the spoils of war, which we'll go on to later. Anyone that was imprisoned or was a slave or that the Europeans would want in trade, they would be bartered for, and they would be sent from ports along the West African coast to the Americas. And that's how it all started in the sort of 1600s. They just needed numbers to churn the sugarcane, because they were doing tobacco at first, but sugarcane became much more profitable, but it needed significant amounts, swathes of manpower, and that's where my direct descendants, the West Africans, that's where they came into play in a big way. Then obviously how that affected the natives is that they would have obviously been consumed by numbers or over-consumed, and eventually they were outnumbered and literally taken over by the black African population, with the few slave masters that were there as well at the same time. And what it is, because of like upset and sort of maybe like societal disruption, it wasn't like a fashionable thing to be labelled like indigenous at that time, and it probably could have like caused harm. So they had to quickly integrate and assimilate with either the European elites, or they would have had to assimilate with the African slave populations. Yeah. So where they were, and also as well on official documents, a lot of them would mislead and lie that they were not indigenous. They would say they were African or African European, because if you said you were indigenous, it went against you, even in a slave society. Yeah. So they had to like obviously mix with the African population, for want of a better word. But what that also means is like most like Jamaicans, like Dominicans, especially Puerto Ricans and Cubans, they've got that in their bloodline somewhere, somehow. They've got that they have like the indigenous throughout in their veins. So where they thought they were extinct, they're actually not. They actually are a part of the Caribbean genome. They may have like black faces, a lot of them, yeah, but they'll have like ancestry dating back to the indigenous, which makes them the original people of Africa, but also the Caribbean as well, which is good to be highlighted. And I just went on and said that obviously this type of culture needs to be, even respected more than African culture in many respects, because originally it was their land. They were the first, they're the natives, so they deserve that respect. And at the end of the day, me as well, like, could be like good chance, like I've got an ancestor, at least one or two, that is from that background, especially the island that I come from, which is an indigenous reserve island. There's a part of it that's an indigenous reserve that is like dedicated to like the Caribs who were first there, and like so very heavy chance that you would have that DNA within you. So they weren't extinct; they live on through people like myself potentially, and a lot of Jamaicans and a lot of Cubans and, as I said, Dominicans and the Spanish Caribbean, etc., etc. So good to know. Good to know, and that'll conclude this episode. Just want to say, this has touched me again. I've enjoyed this short episode. Man, I hope you're enjoying it thus far. Next, I think we're going to cover the Kalinago. This time, I'm going to go into a bit about them now, who are seen as a fierce warrior tribe of the Caribbean. They really, really fought for their existence against the British, who saw them as written down, and as was told to myself in class at school on one occasion. I remember they were savages. They were seen as savages, but really they were just fighting for their land when we look at it now, right? So all good things, all good stuff, all positivity. Once again, I hope this message reaches you well, and deliver this message straight to your heart because it's from mine. All right, love, one, bless, love.